Hello and welcome to History Bubble on Australia. In the previous episodes, we have explored the events and conditions present in the prison colony of New South Wales and its smaller contemporaries, Tasmania and Norfolk Island, and their awful conditions and hardship in dealing with the military. In today's episode, we will see most of that change through one event and the appointment of a new governor. To understand all this, we have to go back a bit to the governorship of Philip Gidley King, and how, until his governorship, the state had held a monopoly on most things in the colony. This was also true for convicts, and until the turn of the century, a vast majority of convicts worked for the government, with the rest doing it indirectly. When the colony grew and got more people, the government could not afford this, and neither wanted it, since there was no threat of annihilation by starvation, and this was the main reason to have everything controlled by the government. This would greatly reduce cost per convict, and as such the government started to almost give out convicts to anyone they thought could provide clothes, food and water, among other necessities for these convicts. So instead of being watched by the government workers, they relied on the settlers' accounts to see if the convicts were well treated, and if a convict felt especially poorly treated, they could complain and maybe be assigned to a new master. King also removed the work hours per week, replacing them with the amount of work done, making convict labor more efficient, giving them more initiatives to work. As after this workload, they could do what they pleased, and many opted to create their own little gardens, and others worked overtime and off hours for extra pay. But their payments were not often done in coin, and instead goods the convicts often did not need. In this state, a new governor was to replace King as the head of the colony. This man was William Bligh, famous for being the captain of the Bounty. His first action was to start cover of rebuilding for small farmers when a flood had struck in parts of the colony. While this exacted the game in the favor of independent farmers, it angered many of the New South Wales cops who had been profiting from the situation. This started a series of decisions that went against corps' interests and made him an enemy to both them and many large landowners, some of these being reducing the use of rum as a trading method and decreasing the amounts of land grants. The biggest enemy Bligh made was a man named John MacArthur, whose rum trade had been greatly disturbed by Bligh's policies, and they had many disputes over other policies. When MacArthur later disobeyed one of Bligh's commands, he was ordered to be arrested, but he was set free by the court full of corps members, whom Bligh accused of mutiny, and ordered the leader of the New South Wales Corps, George Johnston, to deal with them, but he said he was sick. So Bligh went to summon MacArthur instead, and then summoned many New South Wales officers to his house to answer to the charges. And they had to answer to the charges. In response to this, Johnston released MacArthur, and the latter starting a petition to depose Bligh. It was signed by most officers of the corps, and they put him under house arrest. Johnston, now the lieutenant governor, started to put corps members and other allies such as MacArthur in his cabinet, and Australia had once again became a semi-military dictatorship run by the corps. But not for long, as Favor, the lieutenant governor of Norfolk, became appointed the lieutenant governor of New South Wales as well by England, and soon arrived in the colony. But he was also a friend of the corps, so kept Bligh arrested and the corps-filled cabinet. He soon summoned the lieutenant governor of Tasmania, who decided to send Johnston and MacArthur back to England for trial, but then left, leaving Favor to rule the colony. Favor soon also sent Bligh back to England, but he instead sailed to Tasmania in the hopes of getting support in taking back the colony, but he got none and was instead imprisoned. A few years later, Britain sent out a new governor, along with a new regiment, to replace the New South Wales Corps to stop the military dominance of the colony. The new governor's name was Lachlan Macquarie, and he started his governorship by reorganizing the command structure and removing most military men from their roles in the government, and all land grants between the Rum Rebellion and his arrival were removed. After these acts of taking control over the colony, Macquarie now started to work on his real goal of converting what he saw as a prison into a real colony. This was because his view of convicts was quite different to those who came before him, and he felt they needed to be rehabilitated rather than just punished, a quite controversial opinion for its time. He was quite enthusiastic and would work hard to achieve his goals. His first step in achieving this was to decrease the drinking, which ruined many convicts and settlers alike by closing public houses on Sunday and making shares mandatory, so less people could drink on that day. He also tried to decrease the amount of rum coming into the colony by increasing prices, but this only made it easier to drink oneself into debt, as the amount of drinking did not decrease. In the beginning of his term, it was a shortage of convicts, and he wanted new ones, but did not get it, since no ships or soldiers could be spared from the Napoleonic Wars, so Macquarie was using the convicts sparingly, and rarely handing them out to free settlers, since he felt the government could do a better job of reforming them, since they had much more control over the convicts. Macquarie's next project was to improve the colony's infrastructure. At the time of his arrival, it was abysmal, with most of the government building being nothing more than huts, and the roads were not much better, and only the main road to Parramatta was good enough for a cart. Macquarie went to work trying to fix this, so he started creating house plan, even though his knowledge in architecture was indeed slim, and he only had an architecture book to go off, and no architect was present in the colony. But this did not stop him from trying to begin construction on a large 3-story hospital. But before he could do this, he faced an even larger problem. The British government wanted him to cut down costs, not increase them, so wouldn't allow him to make this construction. He went around this problem by calling for a state of emergency, removing this ban. So Macquarie, along with his wife, built up instruction for the building and funded it by putting tariffs on rum, and when the construction was done, it was by far the largest in all of Australia. Later, in 1814, a convict named Francis Greenway arrived in the colony and was almost instantly put to work in designing more buildings in New South Wales. He created buildings unlike anything Australia had ever seen before. He created everything from the female factory in Parramatta to the Hyde Park barracks and the colony's first decent churches. The first two of these providing the first good government housing for convicts. These works also required labour, and Macquarie took most labourers arriving at the colony for the government, angering many free settlers. But they also needed more land, as soon more convicts did indeed arrive, and all land close to Sydney had been taken. This was because the Blue Mountains had made it almost impossible to expand much further. But in 1813, these mountains were finally crossed and later were inspected, and Macquarie decided that a road needed to be built there. So he hired 60 well-behaved convicts and promised them freedom if they would create a road from Parramatta, crossing the Blue Mountains to the fertile lands beyond. It was hard work, and they had to build many bridges and cut over 1,000 meters of road per day, but they managed to do it, gaining their pardon. This was much faster than work on an arguably easier to create road, which took 3 years because of unmotivated labor and bad planning. These efforts, even though very successful, had a huge cost, and by the end of Macquarie's term, these expenses had almost doubled since he took power. This made him less favorable to the government, so they sent out an investigation led by a man more sympathetic to the free settlers than convicts, and thus did not side with Macquarie. But Macquarie argued, since the convicts' population had almost doubled since his appointment, this was only natural. And there were soon too many convicts to give out, so they needed to work publicly, and the colony's infrastructure and general state was so poor, it needed a major change which would benefit them in the future. And when Macquarie was replaced, his successor removed the convicts' own time, wages among other things, and instead opted to give them good reward, such as better work if they were good. That's been History on the Rum Rebellion and Macquarie's Australia, and see you next time.